A mother kisses her children goodbye to stay with her rotting husband in the snow. Discover the heartbreaking sacrifice and the gruesome secret found at the lake. The wind does not howl. It screams with the voice of 1,000 dying horses. Inside the buried cabin, the air is thick with the scent of wet wool, old copper, and the sweet, cloying rot of a man's blackening leg. Louis fumbles with a rusted iron pot, his fingers no longer feeling the bite of the metal. He drops the match. It flickers once, a tiny orange spark against the oppressive gray, then dies. He does not pick it up. His hands are translucent, the skin stretched so thin over the knuckles that it looks like wet parchment ready to tear. Outside, the weight of the mountain is pressing down. 6 feet of fresh white powder sit atop the cedar roof, groaning, waiting for a single timber to snap. Across the room, a child's eyes reflect the dying embers of the hearth. The boy is not crying. He has no moisture left for tears. He is chewing on a strip of hide that was once a harness, his teeth grinding against the leather with a rhythmic, sickening wet crunch. Every breath in this hole is a struggle against the frost that coats the walls in jagged crystals. There is a plate on the floor. It is not filled with beef or bread. It holds thin, gray ribbons of something translucent, boiled until the gristle turned to paste. The smell of the cooking fire is gone, replaced by the heavy, metallic odor of a butcher shop in July. Louis looks at the doorway, or where the doorway used to be before the drifts sealed them in a tomb of ice. He hears it then. Not the wind. Something else. A scraping sound against the roof. A shovel or a claw. He reaches for the heavy skinning knife on the table, but his grip fails. The blade clatters against the floorboards, ringing out in the suffocating silence. He looks at his reflection in the dark water of a bucket. The man staring back is a ghost with a matted beard and pupils blown wide by madness. He wonders if the meat in the pot had a name. He wonders if the people digging from the outside are coming to save him or to judge him. The ice above them cracks like a pistol shot, and the ceiling sags an inch lower. They began this journey seeking a paradise of gold and clover. But now, as the last candle gutters out, the only thing left to discover is which of them will be the final one to be consumed. The dream of California began with the scent of clover and the promise of endless golden afternoons. But it was forged in the dust of 1,000 wagons pushing westward under a relentless sun. In the sweltering heat of July, 1846, the Donner Party stood at a crossroads that would define their existence. They were a line of white canvased ships sailing across a sea of tall grass, led by men who saw the horizon not as a warning, but as an invitation. Among them was Lansford Hastings, a man whose ambition was matched only by the ink on his unverified maps. He spoke of a new way, a shortcut that promised to shave weeks off the grueling journey. It was a siren song that whispered of ease and speed, and despite the quiet warnings of seasoned mountain men, the group turned their oxen toward the jagged teeth of the unknown. The transition from the known trail to the Hastings cutoff was the first silent snap of the trap. As the wagons rolled onto the Great Salt Lake Desert, the lush greenery withered into a blinding white expanse of salt and sagebrush. The sun became a physical weight, a burning hand pressing against the brows of the emigrants. Days stretched into a shimmering haze, where the horizon danced and cheated the eye. Underneath the thin crust of the salt flats lay a treacherous, sucking mud that gripped the wooden wheels like the hands of the dead. Oxen, driven mad by thirst, broke their yokes and vanished into the shimmering heat, leaving the families to abandon their precious heirlooms in the sand. The smell of scorched timber and dying livestock hung heavy in the windless air as the group realized that the map was a lie written in vanity. Every mile gained was a day lost, and time was the one currency they could not afford to waste. The optimistic laughter that had characterized the early camps was replaced by a grim, hollow-eyed silence. They hacked their way through thickets of willow and moved boulders by hand, their fingernails bleeding and their clothes reduced to salt-caked rags. The Sierra Nevada mountains loomed in the distance, a dark and jagged spine of granite that seemed to grow taller with every sunset. The sky began to change, losing its brilliant blue to a bruised, heavy gray. The air grew thin and bit at their lungs with a new, sharp edge. They were no longer travelers on a journey. They were a collective heart beating against the clock of the seasons. The shortcut had become a labyrinth of rock and despair, and the first frost of autumn arrived not as a chill, but as a sentence. By the time the lead wagons reached the foot of the Great Pass, the atmospheric pressure had dropped so low it felt as though the earth itself was holding its breath. The clouds did not drift. They cascaded down the mountain slopes like a slow-motion avalanche of lead. Tamsin Donner looked at the towering peaks and felt the first wet flake touch her cheek. It was a silent, beautiful thing that carried the weight of a shroud. The decision made months ago in the heat of summer had finally caught up to them in the shadow of the summit. They were 5 miles from the top, 5 miles from the descent into the lush valleys of the west. But the sky had closed the gate. The whiteout began as a whisper and ended as a wall, erasing the trail and burying the hope of 47 souls under a blanket of indifference. They had traded their safety for a shortcut to hell, and now the mountain was demanding payment in blood. The sky did not fall. It descended like a heavy, wet wool blanket, suffocating the light until the world turned the color of a bruised plum. By the afternoon of October 31st, 1846, the lead wagons of the Donner Party reached the foot of the final granite wall. The summit was so close they could see the jagged tooth of the pass, but the air was thick with the smell of ozone and impending ice. Then, the first flake landed. It was small, silent, and perfect. Within an hour, those flakes became a white tide, a swirling chaos that erased the wagons, the oxen, and the very ground beneath their boots. The Sierra Nevada had slammed its iron gate shut. The frantic scramble to cross the ridge became a nightmare of churning mud and freezing slush. Men screamed at their oxen, their voices swallowed by the rising roar of the gale. The animals lowed in terror as they sank, belly deep into the white drifts, their warm breath pluming like steam from a dying engine. Every foot gained was lost to the sliding snow. By nightfall, the realization curdled in their chests like sour milk. They were trapped. The group retreated to the shores of Truckee Lake, stumbling through a world where up and down had ceased to exist. They were 5 miles from salvation and 1,000 miles from hope. Shelter became the only god they worshipped. At the lake, they found abandoned cabins from a previous year, little more than rotting logs and dirt floors. Those who could not find wood dug holes into the snow itself, draping tattered canvas over frozen branches to create subterranean tombs. At Alder Creek, the Donner family fared even worse. They huddled under tents and brush hovels as the snow piled higher and higher, sealing them into a darkness that smelled of damp fur and desperation. The wind became a physical enemy, a shivering beast that clawed at the seams of their clothes and sucked the heat from their very marrow. The livestock began to vanish, not into the forest, but beneath the drifts. The oxen stood still as the snow rose over their backs, turning them into white mounds until only their frozen nostrils remained visible. The immigrants thrust long wooden poles into the snow, searching for the carcasses of their only food source. But the mountain hid its loot well. When a pole struck a solid mass, they dug with bleeding fingers, only to find the meat already turning to gray, bloodless stone in the deep frost. Lanterns flickered and died in the oxygen-starved pits beneath the drifts. The heavy silence of the mountain was broken only by the sharp, rhythmic crack of pine limbs snapping under the weight of the white death. Hope flickered one last time in the eyes of the strongest men. But the Sierra was not finished. Day after day, the storms rolled in like waves of an angry sea, stacking layer upon layer of ice over their heads. The wagons that had once been symbols of progress were now nothing more than jagged skeletons protruding from the snow. Inside the cabins, the fire became a hungry mouth that demanded more wood than their weakened arms could chop. They burned their furniture. They burned their hope. They sat in the dim, flickering orange light, listening to the mountain groan. The iron gate was not just closed. It was locked from the outside. The hunger did not arrive as a sharp pain. It began as a hollow echo in the marrow of their bones. By December 1846, the last of the lean oxen had been slaughtered and every scrap of gristle consumed. The families at Truckee Lake looked at their remaining possessions with the eyes of starving wolves. They took the heavy ox hides that served as roofs for their cabins and stripped them bare. They boiled the skin for hours in iron pots until it dissolved into a thick, gray slime. It was a translucent glue that coated the tongue and offered no strength. Children chewed on pieces of charred leather and old bones, their teeth clicking in the frozen silence of the pits. Body horror became the daily reality of the camps. Scurvy began its slow crawl through their systems. Gums turned the color of overripe plums and bled at the slightest touch. Old wounds, long healed, began to tear open as the body consumed its own connective tissue to stay alive. George Donner sat in the gloom of his brush hovel at Alder Creek, watching his hand turn black. A simple cut from a wood axe had invited the rot. The gangrene climbed his arm with a sickening, sweet stench that even the mountain frost could not mask. His flesh was sloughing off in wet gray ribbons, revealing the white gleam of bone beneath. The pets were the next to go. Families wept as they butchered their loyal dogs. But the tears did not stop the knives. When the last of the fur and bone was gone, the madness of the starving brain took hold. Men began to see feast tables spread across the white drifts of the Sierra. They reached for ghost bread and phantom wine, their fingers clutching at nothing but handfuls of dry snow. The light in their eyes shifted, losing the spark of recognition and gaining the flat, predatory stare of the abyss. They were no longer mothers, fathers, or friends. They were lungs and stomachs trapped in cages of shivering skin. 15 of the strongest souls made a final, desperate pact. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope. On handmade snowshoes, they began a climb that no human was meant to survive. They pushed through drifts 20 feet deep, their lungs burning with the thin, crystalline air. On the 6th day, the first of them fell. In the camp of death, as the fire sputtered against a rising blizzard, the ultimate taboo was broken. They did not look at each other as they used the knives. They harvested the only meat left on the mountain. They ate to survive, their faces smeared with the red evidence of their fall from grace. The descent into the void was now complete. Civilization had stripped away like the bark of a dead pine. Inside the cabins back at the lake, the survivors sat in subterranean darkness, listening to the muffled thud of footsteps above. Every time the snow shifted, they wondered if it was a rescue party or another death. They had become creatures of the earth, burrowed deep away from the sun. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against their eardrums until they heard the sound of their own hearts slowing down. They were waiting for the end, or for the next body to grow cold enough to feed the living. The first relief party arrived like ghosts emerging from a wall of white static. It was February 1847, when the shouts of exhausted men finally pierced the frozen silence of Truckee Lake. The survivors did not run to meet them. They crawled. They emerged from holes in the snow like pale, blinking insects, their skin translucent and their eyes sunken into hollow sockets of shadow. The rescuers recoiled at the stench of the subterranean cabins, a thick miasma of unwashed bodies and the sweet, heavy scent of death. But the arrival of the relief was not the end of the nightmare. It was merely the beginning of a new, agonizing arithmetic of survival. The rescuers could only carry a handful of souls back across the treacherous spine of the Sierra. They had limited food and even less strength. A brutal selection began. Parents looked at their children, calculating which of them had the stamina to walk and which were too far gone to be saved. The air was so cold it shattered when they breathed, and the snow remained 20 feet deep, a vast and indifferent sea of white. James Reed, who had been banished from the group months before, returned with the second relief to find his family. He found them living in a tomb, their faces unrecognizable, their humanity clinging by a fraying thread. Tamsin Donner stood in the center of this chaos, a pillar of tragic resolve. Her husband, George, was dying. The rot in his arm had reached his shoulder, and his mind had long since drifted into a feverish haze. Tamsin was offered a place in the line to march towards safety. She looked at the children being bundled into furs, and then at the man she had followed across a continent. She refused to move. She chose to stay in the shadow of the mountain, knowing that the decision was a death sentence. She kissed her daughters goodbye, her lips cracked and bleeding, and watched their small silhouettes vanish into the blinding glare of the snowdrifts. The departure of the relief parties left a heavy, suffocating silence in the camps. Those left behind were the weak, the injured, and the dying. They watched the shadows grow long across the lake, knowing that every sunset brought them closer to the ultimate void. The psychological breakdown was total. In the darkness of the cabins, the survivors ceased to speak. They huddled together for warmth, but there was no comfort in the touch of another shivering body. They were waiting for a third relief, or perhaps for the mountain to simply finish its work. The line between the living and the dead had blurred until it was nothing more than a flicker of a pulse. By March, the food brought by the rescuers was gone. The starvation returned with a renewed, predatory hunger. At the Donner campsite, the snow began to melt slightly, revealing the grim fruit of the winter. The frozen limbs of those who had fallen earlier began to poke through the crust of the ice. The survivors looked at these remains not with horror, but with a desperate, animalistic craving. The last of the social contracts dissolved in the biting wind. They were no longer a community of pioneers. They were isolated islands of agony, waiting for a miracle or the merciful arrival of the end. The mountain watched it all, cold and silent as a tombstone. The sun returned to the Sierra Nevada, not as a savior, but as a witness to the wreckage. By April 1847, the great white shroud began to pull back, revealing a landscape of nightmares. When the fourth and final relief party climbed the pass, they did not find a camp of survivors. They found a charnel house. The silence of the mountain was now absolute, broken only by the drip of melting ice and the rhythmic caw of crows circling the tall pines. The rescuers moved through the slush with cloth pressed to their faces. They saw trees that had been stripped of their bark as high as 12 feet up, marking the height of the snow where desperate hands had reached for anything to chew. At the lake cabins, the snow had retreated to reveal the scattered remains of the fallen. Bones, gnawed and bleached by the frost, lay in the mud alongside discarded clothing and rusted tools. The searchers eventually reached the last occupied shelter and found Louis Kieseberg. He was a specter of a man, sitting amidst the filth and the bones of his companions. His eyes were wide, fixed on a world that no one else could see. He was the final inhabitant of a tomb he had shared with the dead for months. The air inside was thick with the heavy, cloying scent of wood smoke and old iron. He was alive, but the man who had started the journey had long since evaporated into the freezing mist. The survivors who reached Sutter's Fort found a world that was green, warm, and utterly indifferent to their suffering. They stepped out of the shadow of the mountains and into the glare of a public scandal that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The story of the Donner Party spread like a wildfire across the continent, fueled by a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. The very word cannibal became a shadow that followed the 42 survivors through the streets of California. They tried to build new lives in the lush valleys they had dreamed of, but the mountain never truly let them go. They carried the Sierra in their hearts, a frozen, jagged shard of memory that no summer sun could ever melt. The final tally of the tragedy was a grim ledger of 47 dead and 42 survivors. It was a failure written in the ink of arrogance and the blood of the innocent. Today, the lake is a place of serene beauty, where tourists picnic under the same pines that once echoed with the screams of the starving. But the legacy remains etched into the landscape. The 12-foot stumps of the trees still stand in archival photographs as a silent measurement of the depth of their despair. It serves as a haunting reminder of the thin, fragile line between the comforts of civilization and the howling void of the wild. In the end, the Donner Party did not just leave behind a trail of bones. They left a philosophical scar on the American myth of the West. They proved that the wilderness is not a place to be conquered, but a force to be feared. The spirit of Tamsin Donner, who stayed with her dying husband, and the hollow gaze of Keseberg are the twin faces of the tragedy. One represents the heights of human devotion, and the other the depths of our animal survival. As the wind whistles through the past today, it carries a warning for those who think they can outrun nature. The shortcut is a lie. The mountain always wins. The snow covers everything, but it forgets nothing.